The alarm never rang at 4:47 in the morning. It didn't need to. Lucas Merritt had been waking at that exact hour for 11 years, ever since his father. Robert Merritt first pulled him out of bed at 15 and walked him to the edge of the cotton field in the dark, pointing at the horizon where the sky turned from black to a bruised deep purple. "You see that, son?" Robert had said, his voice low and rough like gravel under boot. "That right there is yours. Every inch of it. And it don't care how tired you are. It don't care about your feelings or your problems. It just needs you to show up." Lucas had shown up every day since. Now at 34, he sat on the edge of his bed in the small farmhouse outside of Dalhart, Texas, in the northwest corner of the Panhandle, and pressed both palms against his knees. The room smelled of motor oil, dried cotton, and the faint cedar of an old chest of drawers that had belonged to his grandmother. A single ceiling fan turned slowly above him, pushing the warm air in lazy circles. June had arrived like a punishment, dry, fierce, and unforgiving. He stood, pulled on a worn pair of Wranglers, a faded gray undershirt, and his boots, Ariats, cracked at the toe from years of fieldwork, resoled twice. He didn't look in the mirror. There was no reason to. He wasn't going anywhere except outside. The kitchen was quiet. A coffee maker gurgled on the counter, set the night before on a timer. Lucas poured a mug, drank half of it standing at the sink, and looked through the window at the dark outline of the land. 1,200 acres, or what remained of 1,200 acres. The east parcel, 340 acres, had been sold 2 years ago to pay off the first round of debt following his father's death. That sale had felt like cutting off a finger. Necessary, maybe, but he'd never stopped feeling the phantom of it. He took his hat from the hook by the door, a weathered tan Stetson with a sweat-darkened band, and walked out into the dark. The Merritt farm sat on the high plains of the Texas Panhandle, a landscape that most people from the coasts found either terrifying or beautiful, depending on their temperament. There were no mountains, no trees to speak of, no rivers, just sky and earth, enormous and insistent, stretching in every direction without apology. The sunrises out here were violent things, sudden explosions of orange and red that looked like the horizon itself was catching fire. And by 8 in the morning, the heat had already settled in like a re-welcome guest who intended to stay. Lucas worked the irrigation lines first. The drought that had gripped the Panhandle for the third consecutive summer had dropped the water table significantly, and his center pivot system, a long mechanical arm that rotated around a central point, dragging sprinkler heads over the cotton rows, had developed a pressure problem in the northeast quadrant. He'd been patching it himself, unwilling to pay for a technician he couldn't afford, working through the problem section by section with a combination of mechanical intuition and stubbornness. By 6:30, his shirt was already soaked through. The sun had cleared the flat eastern horizon and was doing its work with ruthless efficiency. Lucas crouched beside a connector joint in the irrigation line, a wrench in one hand, a strip of pipe tape in the other, and felt the sweat drip from the brim of his hat onto the dry earth below. His phone buzzed in his back pocket. He already knew who it was, Mr. Merritt. The voice on the other end was professionally pleasant, the kind of pleasant that had been trained in customer service seminars. Dennis Archer, loan officer at First Plains Bank in Dalhart. "I wanted to follow up on our conversation from last week." "I remember the conversation, Dennis, of course. I just want to make sure we're on the same page regarding the timeline. The restructured note comes due on August 15th. That's 7 weeks from now." Lucas tightened the connector joint, felt the resistance in his wrist. "I know when it's due. The outstanding balance, including accumulated interest, is $214,000. A pause. "Mr. Merritt, I want to be honest with you because your father was a good customer of this bank for 30 years. The board has already had preliminary conversations with several interested buyers regarding the property in the event of a default. I'm not saying that to pressure you. I'm saying it because I think you deserve to know the reality of." "I appreciate that, Dennis. Lucas stood squinting against the early sun. "I'll have something for you before August 15th. He hung up before the man could respond. He stood there for a moment, hat in hand, running a forearm across his forehead. $214,000. He'd been doing the math in his head every day for 8 months, turning it over like a stone, looking underneath it for something that wasn't there. The cotton crop this year was decent, better than last year, but even a strong yield wouldn't come close to that number by August. He'd applied for an emergency agricultural loan through the USDA's Farm Service Agency, but the paperwork had been tangled in processing for 3 months, and the caseworker who called him every 2 weeks never had good news. He put his hat back on and went back to work. Maria Vasquez arrived at 7, as she did every weekday. She was 61 years old, had worked for the Merritt family for 22 years, and treated the farmhouse as a secondary home with a level of proprietary confidence that Lucas had never once questioned. She cooked, cleaned, and managed the household accounts with the precision of a woman who had survived things that would have broken most people and had emerged from the experience deeply unimpressed by drama. "You eat?" she asked as Lucas came through the back door to refill his water jug. "Coffee. Between what a person was doing and what they should be doing." "Sit down, Maria, I've got the—" "Sit down." He sat. She put a plate of scrambled eggs and toasts in front of him without further discussion and turned back to the stove. Lucas ate quickly, the way he did everything, efficiently, without ceremony. "The Caldwell Company sent another letter," Maria said, her back still to him. He stopped chewing. "It's on the counter." He didn't look at the counter. He already knew what the letter said. Caldwell Land and Development had been sending variations of the same letter for 14 months. The offer had started at $800,000 for the remaining 860 acres. Over time, it had climbed $950, then $1.1 million, then a recent offer of $1.4 million. Each letter was written in the same measured, respectful tone that barely concealed the assumption underneath it that everyone had a price and that Lucas Merritt would eventually find his. "Burn it," Lucas said. Maria turned and looked at him. Not the measuring look this time, something quieter, something that had sadness in it. "Lucas, I mean it, Maria." She dried her hands on a kitchen towel and sat down across from him. This was unusual enough that he met her eyes. "Your father loved this land," she said carefully. "You know I know that. I was here. But your father also loved you. And I don't think he would have wanted, Maria." His voice was steady. "I'm not selling to Caldwell." She looked at him for a long moment, then stood, picked up the letter from the counter, and set it on the table in front of him. "Read it first. Then make your decisions." She went back to the stove. Lucas looked at the envelope. The return address read, "Caldwell Land and Development, LLC, Amarillo, TX. He turned it over once in his hands, then set it face down on the table and went back outside. The town of Dalhart sat at the intersection of US 87 and US 87 and US 54 in the far northwest corner of the Texas Panhandle, about 30 miles from the New Mexico border. It had a population of just under 8,000 people, a grain elevator visible from 10 miles out, a Walmart, 3 churches within walking distance of each other, a diner called Patsy's that had been open since 1974, and the specific social architecture of a small agricultural town where everyone knew everyone's business, and half the surnames in the cemetery matched the surnames still farming the surrounding land. Richard Caldwell had grown up in Dalhart. His father had been a small-time real estate agent. Richard had left at 18, gone to UT Austin, studied business, and come back 20 years later, not as a local boy made good, but as something the town wasn't entirely sure how to categorize. A developer who bought land from struggling farmers, consolidated it, and leased it to large agricultural corporations. He'd made a considerable amount of money doing this. He had a house in Amarillo and a secondary home in Dalhart, a large, restored Victorian on Denrock Avenue that the town regarded with a mixture of admiration and unease. He had one daughter. Savannah Caldwell had not been back to Dalhart in 2 years. She drove in from Amarillo on a Tuesday morning in late June, the windows of her white Range Rover down despite the heat, the flat expanse of the panhandle opening around her like something being slowly revealed. She'd forgotten how big the sky was. In New York, the sky was something you glimpsed between buildings, a narrow strip of light or gray overhead, background noise. Here it was the main event. It pressed down on everything with a kind of authority that she'd found suffocating as a teenager, and now, at 29, found unexpectedly moving. She'd left New York 6 days ago, not on a vacation. She hadn't called it anything yet, even to herself, because naming it would have required a clarity she didn't have. What she knew was that the apartment on the Upper West Side had started to feel like a very expensive cage, that the marketing director positioned at the consulting firm she'd held for 4 years had become something she performed rather than something she did, and that the relationship with Connor Whitfield, 3 years. Shared apartment, a shared social calendar, a shared aesthetic, had ended not in a fight, but in a long, terrible conversation on a Sunday afternoon that had felt less like a breakup and more like two people finally acknowledging that they'd been pretending for a very long time. She'd driven to her father's Dalhart house because it was the only place she could think of that felt, in some complicated way, like ground. Richard Caldwell was on the front porch when she pulled into the driveway. He was 63, broad-shouldered, with the permanent tan of a man who spent time outdoors and the careful grooming of a man who spent money on appearances. He hugged her with the particular quality of a man who was relieved but wouldn't say so. "You look thin," he said. "You look the same," she said, which was true. He carried her bag inside. The house was cool and clean, maintained year-round by a housekeeper named Donna, who kept everything exactly as it was when the Caldwells were in residence. The living room had high ceilings, exposed brick, and framed photographs of Texas landscapes. It smelled like cedar and the faint ghost of her mother's perfume, which was impossible, since her mother had been gone for 12 years, but the smell lingered in this house in a way that Savannah had stopped trying to explain. "You hungry?" her father asked. "Not really. You should eat, Dad." He put his hands up, a gesture of retreat he'd perfected over years of being her father. "I'll have Donna make something." They sat on the back porch that evening as the sun went down, the sky performing its nightly extravagance of color, and Richard told her about the business. He couldn't help it. Conversation with her father had always been inseparable from the business, from the deals, from the land. She'd grown up at a dinner table where negotiations were discussed with the same casual familiarity as the weather. "There's a holdout," he said, swirling his iced tea. "The Merritt property. Northwest of town, off Highway 87. Good land, well-watered, historically, solid cotton production. Father died about 2 years ago, left the son with significant debt. We've made multiple offers. The boy keeps refusing." "How old is the boy?" Savannah asked. Richard shrugged. 30-something. Lucas Merritt, stubborn as a fence post. Savannah looked at the darkening horizon. "Maybe he just doesn't want to sell." Her father looked at her with the particular patience of a man who had explained the same thing many times. "Everyone sells eventually, Savannah. It's just a question of timing and number." She didn't argue. She was too tired to argue, and besides, she'd had this conversation in various forms her entire adult life. She looked up at the stars, already visible, already extraordinary, the Milky Way beginning to smear itself across the dark, and felt something she hadn't felt in months: quiet. She found herself driving the farm roads the next morning without quite intending to. She'd borrowed her father's old F-150, the Range Rover felt wrong on these roads, and driven west out of town, windows down, the hot, dry air moving through the cab, patient, slowly dismantling the noise she'd carried in from the city. She pulled onto a gravel road off Highway 87, following a hand-painted sign that read, "Merritt Farm, Private." She wasn't sure what she was doing. She told herself she was just driving. She saw him from half a mile away. He was working the far edge of a cotton field, a figure against the enormous Texas sky, moving along the irrigation line with methodical purpose. She pulled the truck to the side of the gravel road and cut the engine. She didn't get out, she just watched. He didn't notice her. He was too focused on what he was doing, crouching, adjusting, standing, moving forward. Even from this distance, she could see the deliberateness of it. No wasted motion, no phone in hand, no earbuds, just a man and the land and the work, in the kind of total absorption that she hadn't been able to achieve in her own life in longer than she could honestly remember. The sun was already fierce. It was barely 8:30, and heat waves were beginning to shimmer off the flat earth around the field. He worked without stopping, without any visible acknowledgement of the heat. She watched him for longer than she would later admit to herself. And when she finally started the engine and turned back toward town, she felt something she couldn't immediately name. Not attraction, exactly. Or not only that, it was more like recognition. The recognition of someone who was completely, uncomplicatedly present in what they were doing, and the sharp, uncomfortable awareness of how far she was from that herself. She mentioned it to Donna offhandedly, over coffee that afternoon. "The Merritt farm," Donna said, nodding with the authority of a woman who kept track of everything in a 30-mile radius. "Robert Merritt's boy. Lucas. Good man. Quiet. Works himself half to death out there. Everyone in town's been watching to see if the bank takes it. And his mother. Patricia Merritt passed when Lucas was in his 20s. Car accident over near Clayton." Donna refilled Savannah's cup. "He's got nobody out there except Maria Vasquez. She's been cooking and cleaning for that family since forever. Lucas never married. Never seemed to have much time for anything except that farm." Savannah wrapped both hands around the warm mug. "Sounds lonely." Donna looked at her with an expression that was not unkind. "I think he'd say it sounds like commitment." 3 days after her arrival, Savannah walked into Patsy's Diner on the main street at 8 in the morning and found that half the town seemed to have arrived before her. Patsy's was the kind of place that existed as a social institution as much as a restaurant. The coffee was strong, the biscuits were made from scratch, and the booths along the window had hosted more significant conversations than most boardrooms in the county. The walls were covered with local photographs, football teams, harvest celebrations, portraits of families going back 4 decades, and the background noise was a comfortable mix of conversation, silverware, and the periodic ring of a bell from the kitchen. Savannah took a booth by the window and ordered coffee. She was reading through emails on her phone, mostly things she wasn't answering, when she heard the bell above the door and looked up. Lucas Merritt came in the way he apparently did everything, without preamble, without looking around for an audience. He took a stool at the counter, exchanged a brief nod with the woman behind it, and accepted a coffee cup with the automatic ease of a man following a long-established routine. Savannah recognized him immediately, though she'd only seen him from a distance. Up close, he was more substantial than she'd realized, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of physical presence that came from actual work rather than a gym. His face was weathered in a way that added years without taking anything away, with dark circles under his eyes that spoke of too many early mornings and not enough rest. He was wearing a clean shirt, which she got the sense was a concession to being in public, and his hat was on the stool beside him. He was talking to the woman behind the counter, Carol, Savannah would later learn, with the brief, comfortable economy of 2 people who'd been exchanging the same general categories of conversation for years: weather, crops, equipment, a piece of town news. He laughed once, briefly, at something Carol said, a genuine laugh, not a social one, and Savannah found herself watching him with the same odd quality of attention she'd felt on the road 3 days ago. She looked back at her phone. When she looked up again, he was looking at her. Not with recognition, he didn't know who she was, but with the straightforward, unself-conscious directness of someone who noticed things and didn't particularly feel the need to pretend otherwise. Their eyes met for perhaps 2 seconds. He nodded, a minimal, polite acknowledgement, and turned back to his coffee. Savannah felt warmth move up the back of her neck. She was 3,900 miles from New York, and she was blushing in a diner. She didn't introduce herself that morning. She paid for her coffee, left a tip, and walked out into the already building heat of the morning, standing on the sidewalk for a moment with no clear sense of direction. The main street of Dalhart was quiet at this hour. A few pickup trucks, a feed store opening its doors, the smell of dust, and something green and agricultural in the air. Her phone rang. Her father. "I need you to do something for me," he said without preamble. She closed her eyes briefly. "Good morning to you too." "Good morning. I need you to drive out to the Merritt property this afternoon." She opened her eyes. "What?" "I want you to talk to him. Person to person. I've been sending letters and he throws them away. I've had Dennis Archer at the bank call him. He's polite and he hangs up, but sometimes a face-to-face conversation changes things. You're good at conversations, Savannah. You always have been." The irony of this, her father asking her to charm a farmer into selling the land she'd been privately, inexplicably moved by, was not lost on her. "Dad, I don't think that's a good idea. Why not?" She searched for a reason that wouldn't sound like what it was. "'Cause I'm not in the real estate business. You're my daughter. That's better." She looked up at the sky, already a deep, intense blue, the sun a flat white disk above the flat rooftops. "I'll think about it." She didn't go that afternoon. She went the next morning. She drove out to the Merritt farm at 9, telling herself she was going as a favor to her father, which was only partially true. She turned onto the gravel road and followed it to the farmyard, a tidy complex of a farmhouse, a large metal barn, a smaller equipment shed, and 2 grain storage bins, all worn but well maintained. A border collie materialized from behind the barn and regarded her with professional suspicion. She got out of the truck. Lucas Merritt appeared from the direction of the equipment shed, wiping his hands on a shop rag. He stopped when he saw her, and she saw the moment recognition moved across his face, the slight recalibration of his expression as he placed her from the diner. "Morning," he said. "Good morning." She walked toward him, her hand extended. "Savannah Caldwell." His expression didn't change much, but something in it did. Something behind the eyes, a very brief tightening. He looked at her hand, then took it. His grip was firm and brief. "Lucas Merritt, I know." She dropped her hand. "I'm sure you know who I am too. Richard Caldwell's daughter." His voice was even, not hostile, not warm. "You drive out here to make me an offer?" "I drove out here because my father asked me to." She'd decided on the drive over that honesty was the only approach that had any chance of being respected. He thinks a face-to-face conversation might go differently than letters and phone calls. He's right that it goes differently. Lucas tucked the shop rag into his back pocket. "Letters I can put down, phone calls I can end. Face-to-face I have to say it directly, which I'm happy to do. I'm not selling." She'd expected this. She'd prepared for this. What she hadn't prepared for was the absolute absence of performance in the way he said it. No anger, no defensiveness, no need to justify himself. Just a fact, stated with the same matter-of-fact tone as a weather report. "I heard you," she said. "Can I ask why? Off the record. Just why?" He looked at her for a moment, assessing. Then he looked out over the field, the cotton rows running in clean parallel lines toward a horizon that seemed to extend forever. "My grandfather broke this land. My father worked it for 40 years. My father's father is buried on the east edge of that property, the part one had to sell 2 years ago." He paused. "Caldwell Land buys it, consolidates it with the rest of the parcels, and leases it to some corporate operation out of Lubbock that'll run a pivot system and not know a single name of anyone who ever lived here. That's why." Savannah stood in the heat and looked at the field. A meadowlark was singing somewhere in the cotton, a bright, cascading song that seemed almost reckless in its beauty against the dry landscape. "I understand that," she said quietly. He looked at her with a measured skepticism. "Do you?" "My grandfather built things too." She met his eyes. "Different things than yours, but he built them. And my father bought other people's things instead of building his own." She hadn't intended to say that. It had come out of somewhere she hadn't been paying attention to. I understand more than my last name suggests. Lucas was quiet for a moment. The border collie had settled at his feet, watching Savannah with the same measured attention as its owner. "I've got work to do," Lucas said finally. "I know." She walked back toward the truck. "I won't keep coming out here, Ms. Caldwell." She turned. He was watching her with an expression she couldn't fully read. Not warm, but not closed either. Something in between. "Tell your father the answer's the same, whatever the number is." She nodded and got in the truck. She drove back to town more slowly than she'd driven out. Maria Vasquez noticed things. It was, in her estimation, the most useful skill a person could have, and she had cultivated it over 6 decades with the dedication of a professional. She noticed that Lucas had eaten lunch that day, which he often didn't. She noticed that he'd been quieter than usual in the afternoon, which was saying something. And she noticed that he'd stood at the kitchen window for an unusual amount of time that evening, looking out at the road. She didn't say anything. She understood the value of that too. Savannah told her father the visit hadn't worked. "What did he say?" Richard asked. "That the answer's the same, whatever the number is." Her father set down his glass with the deliberate restraint of a man suppressing a response. "Stubborn." "Committed," Savannah said, and heard the echo of what Donna had told her. Her father looked at her. "Is there a difference?" She thought about the way Lucas had stood in that farmyard, the quietness of him, the absolute groundedness, the sense of someone who knew exactly where they were and why. She thought about herself at 37,000 feet on the flight back from the last quarterly review, looking down at the grid of lights below and feeling a terrifying hollowness, a sense that she was moving very quickly in a direction she'd never actually chosen. "Yes," she said, "I think there is." She went back to Patsy's the next morning, and the one after that. Not because she expected Lucas to be there, though he sometimes was. Because Patsy's was the kind of place where the world moved at a pace she could follow, where the conversations were real, and the coffee was strong, and nobody was managing a personal brand. On the 4th morning, he was there again. This time he took the booth across from hers rather than the counter stool, and he had a folded section of the newspaper with him and a legal pad covered in numbers that he studied with the focused intensity of a man trying to solve an equation that didn't have a good solution. She didn't speak to him. He didn't speak to her. But when he got up to leave, he paused at her table. "You take that road off 87 again," he said without preamble. She blinked. "Sorry, early morning couple days ago." Gray F-150 pulled off by the field. His expression was not accusatory, just factual. "That was you." She held his gaze. "Yes." He nodded slowly, as if something had been confirmed. "Why?" She considered lying or deflecting, and decided against both. "I was driving. I stopped because I saw someone working, and I watched for a while." A pause. "I don't know why, exactly." Lucas looked at her for a long moment. A muscle moved in his jaw. "And most people look at that land and see a dollar amount," he said. They don't stop to look at it." He left without another word. But Savannah sat in the booth for another 20 minutes, her coffee growing cold, thinking about the way he'd said it, and the fact that, for reasons she couldn't yet articulate, it felt like the first honest conversation she'd had in a very long time. July arrived, and the heat became something that had weight and texture. By 7 in the morning, the thermometer on the barn wall read 94 degrees. By noon, it had climbed past 108. The sky was white at the horizon and deep blue directly overhead, and the light came off the dry earth in waves that made the distance shimmer and distort. The cotton was growing, better than Lucas had dared hope, but the irrigation system was fighting the drought constantly, and the fuel costs alone for the pumping equipment were running $1,500 a week. He ran the numbers every night. He'd been running them for months. Every scenario he could construct ended in the same place. Not enough. Not by August 15th. The USDA loan application remained suspended in bureaucratic amber. He'd called the caseworker 4 times in July. Each time, The woman, a pleasant but overextended officer named Barbara Simmons, expressed genuine sympathy and confirmed that the application was still under review. He'd stopped explaining the situation to people in town. He could see it in their faces when the subject came up, that particular mixture of respect and pity that small communities extend to people they've known their whole lives who are losing something. He didn't want the pity. He just wanted to be left alone to figure it out. He was repairing a section of fence along the south boundary on a Wednesday afternoon when he heard a vehicle on the road and looked up to see a white Range Rover, not the gray F-150 this time. It slowed at the fence line and stopped. Savannah Caldwell got out. She was wearing jeans and boots this time, not the clothes she'd had on during her official visit. She had her hair pulled back and no visible evidence of the careful presentation she'd been wearing the first day. She looked, Lucas thought with the discomfort he didn't fully examine, more like someone who actually belonged here. "I'm not here about the property," she said before he could speak. He straightened and held the fence post he'd been setting. "All right, I'm here because..." She stopped, looked at the fence post, then at him. "I brought lunch. Maria told me at the diner that you don't stop to eat." Lucas stared at her. "You talked to Maria?" "She was at the diner. She's very direct." Savannah walked back to the Range Rover and came back with a paper bag from Patsy's. She held it out. He looked at the bag. He looked at her. The absurdity of the situation was not lost on him. Richard Caldwell's daughter standing at his fence line, holding a paper bag lunch like an offering, while he sweated through his shirt and tried to make sense of what was happening. He took the bag. They sat on the lowered tailgate of the F-150 he'd parked nearby, and he ate a roast beef sandwich while she drank a bottle of water, and they talked. Not about the land, not about Caldwell development, about the landscape itself, the way the light hit it, the color of the soil, the sound the wind made coming across an open field when you stopped to actually listen. She'd been walking the farm roads in the early morning, she told him. She'd been up at 5, unable to sleep, and had walked 3 miles out and 3 miles back with the sky changing colors above her. "You didn't grow up wanting to leave," he said. It was an observation rather than a question. "I didn't grow up wanting anything specific," she said honestly. "I just moved in the direction things pointed, school, career, the right city, the right apartment." She turned the water bottle in her hands. "I don't think I've wanted something purely for its own sake since I was about 12 years old." Lucas chewed, swallowed, said nothing. He'd found that silence was often more useful than filling it. "What do you want?" she asked him. "This." He gestured at the land around them. "Just this." She looked out at the field. The cotton was green and white, the rows perfectly spaced, running to the horizon. "Then why is it so complicated?" "Because wanting something doesn't make the bank agree with you." He said it without bitterness. "And because my father died believing the land was in better shape than it was. He had debts he didn't tell me about. When I found out, it was already late." "I'm sorry." "Don't be, it's not your fault." He paused. "Or it's not yours specifically." She absorbed that. "My father's company. His company made Robert Merritt offers for 20 years. I don't know what that did to my father, watching this land get treated like an asset on someone else's spreadsheet. It's not nothing." He stood, rolled the paper bag, tucked it behind the seat. "I'm not holding it against you, but I'm not pretending it's not true either." Savannah was quiet. She had the look of someone revising their understanding of something, which was, Lucas was slowly discovering, her most genuine expression. When she was thinking, honestly, really thinking, her face did something entirely different than when she was managing a conversation. "I didn't know," she said. "I knew my father bought land. I didn't think about what it felt like to be the person on the other side. Most people don't." She looked at him. "Do you think I'm like him?" He held her gaze. It was a real question, asked with a real vulnerability. He respected it enough to give it a real answer. "No," he said. "I think you're trying to figure out if you are." She blinked, looked away. A red-tailed hawk was circling above the field in a long, lazy spiral, riding a thermo with minimal effort, barely moving its wings. They both watched it for a moment. She turned and looked at him with a surprise she didn't try to hide. He met it with the same matter-of-fact steadiness he brought to everything, and after a moment, the surprise softened into something else, something she chose not to name, at least not yet. "All right," she said. "I'll come back." She did. Every other morning for the next 2 weeks, she drove out to wherever Lucas was working and simply appeared. She didn't ask permission. He didn't offer it. But he also didn't object, and she was learning to read the difference between his silences and his objections, which were distinct things. She helped when he let her, which was gradually more often. She held fence posts while he set them. She handed him tools from the box. She learned the names of the irrigation components and what each one did, and she asked about the cotton, how it grew, what it needed, what a good yield looked like, what the market price per pound was doing this year. He answered everything directly, without explanation of why she might care. He seemed to take seriously the fact that she was asking, which was different from how most people in her life had. Treated her questions as social noise to be managed rather than genuine inquiry to be engaged with. What she hadn't anticipated was how much she looked forward to it. Richard Caldwell noticed his daughter's absence from the house in the mornings with the instinct of a man who'd spent his career reading situations. He made an inquiry with the precision of someone who knew how to get information without appearing to want it, a conversation with Donna, a casual mention to a contact at the bank, a drive past the Merritt property at a time he knew Savannah would be there. He said nothing to her directly, not yet, but on the evening of July 18th, he made a phone call to his attorney in Amarillo, and the following morning, he made another call to Dennis Archer at First Plains Bank. "I want to know the exact status of the Merritt account," he said, "and I want to know if there's any flexibility on the timeline." Archer's response told him everything he needed to know. Richard Caldwell hung up the phone and sat at his desk for a long moment, looking out at the back garden where the dry July wind was moving the dry July grass in patterns that looked, if you weren't paying attention, almost like water. He began to write. Lucas received the certified letter on July 21st. He signed for it at the mailbox, carried it to the porch, and opened it with the same deliberateness with which he did everything. He read it once, then he sat down on the porch steps and read it again. It was not an offer to purchase. It was a notification that Caldwell Land and Development had entered into a formal agreement with First Plains Bank to purchase the existing Merritt Farm loan at face value, effective as of August 1st. This was a legal transaction known as a debt assignment. The bank, faced with a likely default, had agreed to sell the note to Caldwell, which would become the new lender of record. If Lucas defaulted on August 15th, the foreclosure proceedings would be managed not by the bank, but by Caldwell Land and Development. In practical terms, it meant that his last 2 weeks of maneuvering room had just been eliminated. He sat on those steps for a long time. The border collie came and pressed against his leg. He put his hand on the dog's head without looking down. He'd known this was possible. He'd known, in the abstract, that a company with Caldwell's resources could move around him in ways he couldn't predict. He'd just allowed himself to believe that they wouldn't, that there was something, some basic rule of decency in dealing, that would keep the fight in the open. He'd been wrong. Maria found him there when she arrived at 7:30. She read the letter without being asked. She set it back on the step beside him with the careful movements of a woman who knew that some news required a moment before it required a response. "I'll call Father Dominguez," she said quietly. "Don't." He stood. "I don't need prayers. I need an attorney. You know any attorneys?" "I know one. School friend. Works in Amarillo. I haven't called him in 3 years." "Then call him." He went inside. He called Daniel Sungjin Park, who'd sat next to him in 9th grade English, and who was now, as far as Lucas knew, a real estate and contract attorney at a firm in Amarillo. It went to voicemail, then he went back to work. Because the cotton still needed water and the sun was still coming up and the land still needed him, regardless of who thought they owned the note. Savannah arrived at the farm the following morning and found it immediately. The quality of the stillness around the place was different. Not the working silence she'd come to recognize. Something heavier. She found Lucas in the barn, working on the pivot motor with a focus so total it looked less like concentration and more like a man, trying to outrun something by staying inside the machinery. "What happened?" she said. He didn't look up. "Your father bought my loan from the bank." The silence that followed lasted several seconds. "I didn't know," she said. "I know you didn't. He set down the wrench, but it doesn't change what it is." She stood at the barn door with the sunlight behind her and the cool shadow of the barn in front, and she felt something move through her. A cold, specific clarity that was different from the vague guilt she'd been carrying for weeks. This was concrete. This was her father's name on a document that could take this land from this man. "I need you to know I didn't know," she said again, because it mattered to her that he understood. "Savannah." He finally looked at her. His face was controlled, but she'd learned his face well enough by now to see what was underneath it. "What do you want to do about it?" It was the most important question anyone had asked her in years. She drove back to her father's house at a speed slightly above what was sensible on a gravel road, the dust rising behind the Range Rover in a long white plume. She pulled into the driveway, cut the engine, and sat for a moment with both hands on the steering wheel. She'd been here before, she realized. Not at this house, not on this particular morning, but at this junction, this moment where she could see clearly what was in front of her and had to decide whether clarity was enough to act on. She'd been at this junction in New York when she'd understood, months before she admitted it, that the job was hollow and the relationship was performance. She'd stood at that junction and turned away from it until turning away became too expensive. She wasn't going to do that again. She went inside. Her father was in the study on the phone. He held up a finger when she appeared in the doorway. 1 minute. She stood in the doorway and waited. He finished the call, set the phone down, and looked at her with the expression of a man who had been expecting this conversation and had prepared for it. "You bought his loan," she said. "It's a legal transaction. The bank was going to take a loss on a likely default. You bought his loan after sending me out there to talk to him." Her voice was steady. She'd decided on the drive over that she wasn't going to do this with her voice raised, because raised voices gave her father permission to treat the conversation as emotional rather than substantive. "You used me." Richard Caldwell sat back in his chair. "I asked you to have a conversation. You asked me to have a conversation while you were simultaneously engineering a legal mechanism to take the property regardless of whether the conversation worked. That's not a conversation, that's theater." She crossed the room and sat down across from him. "I want to know what you actually intend to do with that farm." He studied her. "What I always intended. Consolidate it with the adjacent parcels leased to a larger operation. He has 860 acres under active cultivation. His yield this year is good. He's not a failing operation. He's a man with debt he inherited from his father who's been fighting to stay above water." She leaned forward. "What's the actual number, Dad? What does Caldwell Development make on this one parcel?" He named a number. It was a number she recognized, the kind of number that, in a New York conference room, would have produced a satisfied murmur around a table. Here, in this study, in this town, with the image of Lucas Merritt reading a certified letter on his front porch fixed somewhere in her mind, it sounded like something different. "I'm going to ask you to release the note," she said. Her father looked at her. "I'm asking you to transfer the loan back to First Plains Bank or to a third-party lender at fair value, removing Caldwell Development from the equation." She held his gaze. "Give him the chance to make the payment on August 15th without the threat of Caldwell holding the paper, Savannah." His voice had shifted, not unkind, but firm with the particular firmness of a man who was about to explain something he'd explained before. "This is a business. I know it's a business. Sentiment doesn't. I'm not asking you on sentimental grounds. She'd thought about this on the drive over. She'd thought about it clearly. I'm asking you on ethical ones. What you did going to the bank behind the scenes while I was out at that farm talking to him was a manipulation. You know it was. And I'm telling you that I'm not willing to be part of it. The room was quiet. Through the study window, she could see the back garden, the dry summer grass, the heat shimmer over the fence, the pale Texas sky. And if I don't, her father said quietly. She stood. Then I go back to New York, and we don't talk about this again, and you and I both know what that conversation costs. She walked to the door, paused. He has a friend, an attorney in Amarillo. If that attorney finds grounds to challenge the debt assignment, it becomes a public legal matter. A story about Caldwell. Development using predatory debt acquisition to force a generational family farm into foreclosure is not a story you want told in this county during an election year. She turned and looked at him. I'm not threatening you. I'm describing a reality. Richard Caldwell sat very still. I'll think about it, he said. I know you will. She left. She drove back to Patsy's and sat in the same booth she'd been sitting in for weeks, and she called Daniel Park's office in Amarillo. She'd found the number herself. It hadn't been hard. I'm calling about the Merritt farm, she told the receptionist. My name is Savannah Caldwell. I have information that may be relevant to the case. She knew as she said it that she was stepping over a line she couldn't step back over. She knew her father would find out. She knew what it would cost in their relationship. The careful, managed. She was ending that. She sat with that knowledge while she waited to be put through, and she found, not without surprise, that she felt lighter than she had in months. Lucas met with Daniel Park by phone that afternoon. The attorney had done his research quickly. He told Lucas that the debt assignment was legal, but that there were potential grounds for a challenge based on the specific terms of the original notes transfer provisions. It wasn't a certainty, but it was enough to slow the process. More importantly, Daniel told him, he'd received a call that morning from a woman named Savannah Caldwell, who had offered to provide documentation and testimony regarding the timeline of the acquisition. There was a long silence on Lucas's end. You know her? Daniel asked. I know her, Lucas said. She's Caldwell's daughter. I know who she is. Another silence. Lucas, I know what it is. He was standing at the kitchen window looking out at the field. The cotton in the evening light was the color of old gold, the white bowls beginning to open. What does it change legally? It changes the optics of a challenge significantly. A court takes a different view of a debt assignment if there's evidence that the acquiring party had prior knowledge of specific operations on the property through a party they directed to engage with the landowner. It's not airtight, but it's enough to make the other side think twice about pushing this to foreclosure. Lucas stood at that window for a long time after he hung up. He went outside and walked the fence line at dusk, a thing he did when he needed to think, had done with his father as a boy. The sky was enormous above him, fading from orange to purple to a deep velvet blue, and the first stars were beginning to appear. The land around him was quiet, except for the wind and the sound of the pivot system moving in the distant field, a slow, reliable rotation, water arcing in the evening light. He'd been angry for the last 2 days. He could feel it still. Not the hot anger of betrayal, but the cold anger of a person whose careful, patient work has been disrupted by someone else's carelessness. The kind of anger that, if you were honest with yourself, was really fear wearing a hard face. But underneath the anger was something else now. Something he didn't quite have a name for. But that had to do with a woman in a Patsy's Diner booth who had called an attorney she'd found herself and offered testimony that could cost her things he understood only partially. He pulled out his phone and called her. She answered on the second ring. Why did you call Daniel? He said. Because it was the right thing to do. No hesitation. It's going to cause problems with your father. Yes. He was quiet. Above him, the stars were multiplying. the Milky Way beginning its slow emergence. A coyote called somewhere to the north, a thin, ascending wail that the dark ate immediately. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I know." A pause. "That's why I did it." He stood on the fence line under the enormous Texas sky and felt something he hadn't felt in a very long time. Not hope, exactly, because hope had too much weight attached to it, too many previous times it had cost him. But something adjacent to hope, something that was beginning and not yet named. "Come to the farm tomorrow morning," he said. "What time?" "Before sunrise. There's something I want to show you." She arrived at 4:50 in the morning. The world was still dark, the stars still present, the air carrying the specific cool sweetness it held for exactly this 1 hour before the heat resumed its position. Lucas was on the porch with 2 coffees, and he handed her one without ceremony. They walked out into the cotton field together, in the dark, moving along the row edges, the plants brushing their legs, and he didn't explain where they were going or why. She didn't ask. She was learning by this point that with Lucas the experience came before the explanation, and the explanation was often unnecessary. They stopped at the center of the field. The cotton was waist-high around them. The sky above was the deep pre-dawn blue, the stars beginning to fade at the eastern horizon, where the first, barely perceptible suggestion of light was beginning. "Watch," he said. She watched. The sunrise on the Texas Panhandle was, as always, a production that had no sense of proportion. It came up fast and total, the horizon igniting in streaks of red and orange and gold that swept upward with alarming speed, turning the sky from dark to fire to pale blue in the span of 15 minutes. The light hit the cotton field and turned the white bowls into something that glowed, thousands of small lights, close to the ground, stretching in every direction. Savannah stood in the center of it and felt something in her chest that she recognized as grief, not the grief of loss, but the grief of having missed something, of having spent years moving at a speed that made this impossible. Lucas was watching the field, not her. His face in the early light was something she would remember for a long time, not emotional, exactly, but open in a way she rarely saw it. Opened by something larger than himself. "This is what I'm fighting for," he said. She understood. She had understood since the first morning she'd pulled over on the gravel road and watched a man work in the early light. She just needed to get here, to stand inside it, rather than watching it from a distance. "I know," she said. He looked at her then. For a long moment, in the light of a Texas sunrise, surrounded by cotton that he'd planted and irrigated and fought for. He looked at her with everything visible, not just the steadiness and the pride and the stubbornness, but the exhaustion underneath it and the fear and the absolute unwillingness to let any of those things be the final word. She reached out and took his hand. He let her. The legal challenge filed by Daniel Park landed in the Dahlem County Courthouse on July 28th. 2.5 weeks before the August 15th deadline. It was not, in itself, a guaranteed victory. Daniel had been precise about that from the beginning. The debt assignment was legally valid, and the challenge rested on specific procedural arguments about the terms of the original note and the methods Caldwell Development had used in its acquisition. But the filing changed the calculus. Richard Caldwell received the documents from his Amarillo attorney on the morning of July 29th. He read them in his study with the door closed. Then he sat with them for a long time. He was not, at his core, a cruel man. He had told himself this for years, and in most of the evidence of his life it was supported. He employed people fairly, paid above market rates for the land he acquired, and had donated substantially to the Dalhart Community Foundation for over a decade. The predatory edge of the Merritt acquisition, the decision to go around the front of the negotiation and move through the back door of the bank while his daughter was building something at that farm, had been, he could admit privately, a miscalculation. He hadn't counted on Savannah choosing a side. He hadn't counted on it because for most of her life Savannah had declined to choose sides. She'd managed the complicated geography of being his daughter, his ambition, his methods, the legacy she both benefited from and was quietly embarrassed by, with a careful neutrality. She'd taken the money and kept a distance from the source. He'd accepted that arrangement without examining it too closely. What she'd done now was different. What she'd done was refuse the arrangement. He picked up the phone and called his attorney. He gave a specific instruction. The attorney was briefly surprised, then professional. The call lasted 4 minutes. On August 2nd, 13 days before the deadline, Caldwell Land and Development transferred the Merritt Farm loan back to First Plains Bank at face value, exiting the debt agreement entirely. There was no press release, no announcement. Dennis Archer called Lucas that afternoon with a barely concealed bewilderment in his voice, explaining that the situation had resolved itself and that Lucas was once again in standard pre-default proceedings with the bank. Lucas sat with the phone in his hand after the call ended. He called Daniel Park, who confirmed the transfer had been filed. "I don't know what changed their mind," Daniel said, "but the challenge appears to have been persuasive." "Thank you," Lucas said. "Thank your friend," Daniel said. Whatever she told them, it worked. He found her at Patsy's. She was in the usual booth, hands wrapped around a coffee cup, and when he came through the door and she looked up, he saw something in her face that was very tired and very steady at the same time. The face of someone who had gone through something and come out on the other side with their position intact. He sat down across from her. "He withdrew," he said. "I know." She looked at the coffee cup. "He called me this morning." "What did he say?" She was quiet for a moment. "He said that he disagreed with my methods, but that he'd had time to consider whether the acquisition was consistent with how he wants the company to operate." She glanced up. "That's as close to an apology as my father gets." "Is it enough?" "I don't know yet." She held his gaze. "It might take a while to know." He understood that. He'd spent 2 years coming to terms with what his own father had left him. The debt, the complexity, the gaps between the man he'd believed in and the reality of what remained. It wasn't something that resolved in a single conversation. "The USDA loan came through," he said. Her eyes widened slightly. "When?" "This morning, couple of hours after Archer called." He said it with the controlled evenness of a person who hasn't yet fully processed something. 180,000. USDA Emergency Agricultural Loan Program. 5.2%, 20-year term. He paused. "It doesn't cover the full amount, but it puts me within range. I can bridge the rest with this year's harvest." The thing that happened in her face when she was really thinking moved across her features now. A softening, a recalibration. "You're going to make it," she said. "I'm going to make it." She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. He could see it in her face, the particular quality of relief that belongs to people who have invested themselves in an outcome, which was something she'd only recently learned to do. August 15th came without ceremony. Lucas drove to First Plains Bank in the early morning, signed the restructured loan documents Dennis Archer had prepared, wrote a check for the balance due, a number he'd arrived at through a combination of the USDA loan, the advance on the cotton crop from the local gin, and the last of a savings account he'd been guarding for 3 years, and shook Archer's hand in the lobby of a bank that smelled of carpet cleaner and industrial air conditioning. "I'm glad it worked out, Lucas," Archer said. "Thank you for calling me before you sold to Caldwell," Lucas said. Because Archer had called, that was true. He'd made the call as a courtesy, and Richard Caldwell had moved quickly enough that the call had come the day before the transfer. Lucas had never decided how he felt about that. He filed it under complicated and moved forward. He drove back to the farm under a sky that was everything the Texas Panhandle sky was in mid-August. Huge and blue and merciless, with heat and beautiful in a way that didn't care whether you noticed or not. He turned onto the gravel road, parked in the yard, and sat in the truck for a moment. The border collie came around the barn. Maria's car was in the drive. The cotton field stretched away to the south in clean green rows, the white bowls open and full, waiting for the first pass of the picker in 2 weeks. He got out of the truck. Maria had made a meal. Not the usual breakfast, a proper meal midday, with tamales and rice and beans and a cake she'd been working on since 6 in the morning, which she set on the table without explanation and cut into immediately, as if the presence of the food said everything that needed saying. "Sit," she said. He sat. She sat across from him, which she rarely did, and put her hands flat on the table and looked at him with an expression that had no measuring in it, no assessment, just warmth, uncomplicated and full. "Your father would be proud," she said. He looked down at the plate. He was not a person who cried, had not cried in years, but he felt the pressure of it behind his eyes in a way he acknowledged and then set aside. "He left me a mess," he said. He was proud of the land and ashamed of the debt, and he didn't know how to hold both of those things at the same time. Most people don't. Maria pushed the cake toward him. "That doesn't make him less worth being proud of." Lucas ate. The tamales were extraordinary, they always were, and the cake was a yellow cake with a simple white frosting. And the afternoon light came through the kitchen window at an angle that turned the table into something almost incandescent. "She's good for you," Maria said, without preamble, without setup. He didn't pretend not to know who she was talking about. "It's complicated. Everything's complicated." Maria's tone suggested that this particular observation was not as useful as he seemed to think. Simple things don't require courage. He looked at her. She held his gaze with the serenity of a woman who had been making incontrovertible points for 61 years and had no intention of stopping. "I'll talk to her," he said. "Today, Maria. Today, Lucas." He finished the cake. Savannah was at the house on Denrock Avenue packing. Not with urgency, with the thoughtful consideration of someone making a decision rather than executing a departure. She'd been in Dalhart for 6 weeks. Her apartment in New York was sublet through September, a detail that had seemed logistically convenient 2 months ago, and now felt like something else. Like a door she'd left open without fully understanding why. She folded a linen shirt and set it in the suitcase. Picked up a book she'd been reading, a history of the Texas Panhandle she'd found on her father's shelf, of all places, and turned it over in her hands. She'd been reading it in the evenings on the back porch, learning the names of the towns, the history of the soil, the economics of dryland farming, the stories of the families who'd broken this land and stayed on it through the Dust Bowl and the oil busts and the slow droughts. She put the book in the suitcase. Her father had been polite at breakfast. Careful. The particular carefulness of a man navigating new territory in a relationship that had previously operated on well-established rules. She'd been polite back. They were, she thought, beginning something. A renegotiation of what they were to each other, which was going to be slow and imperfect and probably necessary. She heard a truck on the gravel outside. She crossed to the window. Lucas Merritt's F-150 was in the drive. She went downstairs and out the front door. He was standing by the truck, hat in hand, which she had learned was a significant gesture. The removal of the hat, the one visible indication that he was not entirely inside his usual composure. He looked at her with the straightforward directness that she'd come to understand as his version of openness. "It's done," he said. "I know." She'd gotten the call from her father. "How does it feel?" He thought about it honestly, which was the only way he thought about things. Like the floor stopped moving. She stood on the front porch of her father's house in the August heat, the sun overhead, without mercy, the dry air moving in off the fields, and looked at this man who had just spent 2 years fighting for something he believed in, with a stubbornness she'd initially categorized as limitation, and now understood as a kind of moral architecture, the structure a person builds around their most essential values and refuses to dismantle regardless of the pressure. "I'm packing," she said. Something moved across his face, brief, controlled. "I know. My sublet is through September, I know." She held his gaze. "I'm not sure what I'm going back to." He took a step forward. "Then don't go back to it yet." She was quiet. "I'm not asking you to make a decision about anything," he said. "I'm asking you to stay through the harvest." He turned the hat in his hands once, twice. "It's something you should see. If you're going to understand what this place is, you need to see the harvest." Savannah looked at him for a long time. She thought about the New York apartment with its view of the street and its carefully chosen furniture and its absolute silence on the question of who she actually was. She thought about the morning in the cotton field when the sun came up and turned everything gold, and she'd felt grief for all the mornings she'd spent in motion rather than standing still. She thought about a man who'd stood at a fence line and told her the truth without dressing it up. "Through the harvest," she said. "Through the harvest." The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, but the nearest approach to one she'd seen from him in daylight. And it changed his face in a way that she stored quietly and carefully. She went back inside to unpack the suitcase. The harvest began on September 3rd. Lucas had contracted a custom harvesting crew, 3 cotton pickers and a module builder. Men who moved from farm to farm across the panhandle through September and October, following the opening bolls north to south. They arrived before dawn with equipment so large it seemed impossible that it had traveled on regular roads. And by 6 in the morning, the first picker was moving through the field with a low, mechanical roar, stripping the cotton from the plants in long, efficient passes and feeding it back through the machine in a continuous stream of white fiber. Savannah watched from the field edge for the first hour, coffee in hand, in the cool of the early morning. Then she moved closer until she could feel the machines work through the ground beneath her feet. She watched Lucas coordinate the crew with the quiet authority of a man in his element, speaking briefly, precisely, moving between the equipment with sure-footed familiarity, checking quality at the module builder, running numbers in his head that she could see in the focus of his expression. He was doing what he'd been doing every morning since she'd first seen him from half a mile away on a gravel road, showing up completely without audience or performance for the thing he'd committed himself to. She understood, watching him, that this was what she'd recognized from the beginning. Not just the work itself, but the wholeness of it. The absence of the gap between what he believed and what he did. She'd been living in that gap for years, and she'd been so accustomed to its presence that she'd stopped noticing how much energy it consumed. Maria appeared at her elbow at some point in the mid-morning with a thermos of coffee and stood beside her in companionable silence, watching the picker complete its pass. "You going to stay?" Maria asked. "I don't know what staying looks like," Savannah said honestly. "Nobody does, at first." Maria poured coffee into the thermos cap and handed it over. "You figure out what you can contribute. Then you contribute it. Then you see what that makes you into." She looked out at the field. "It's not so complicated. It feels complicated." "That's because you're used to complicated." Maria's voice was gentle. "Simple things feel wrong to people who've been doing complicated for too long." By the end of the first week of harvest, the numbers were coming in well. Lucas sat at the kitchen table on the 7th evening with a calculator and a notepad and ran the final projections with the kind of focused attention that had previously been inseparable from anxiety. This time was different. The numbers still required careful management. Farming always did, and always would, but the floor was solid under him. And what he was doing with the numbers now was planning rather than surviving. Savannah sat across the table, working on her own notebook. She'd been in contact with a small agricultural nonprofit based in Lubbock that worked with family farms on sustainable water management, a conversation that had started as research and was becoming something she was increasingly serious about. She'd spent years applying her analytical skills to work that had interested her only abstractly. This was different. This was concrete and local and connected to things she could see and touch. She looked up and found him watching her. "What?" she said. "Nothing." but his expression was the open one, the one she'd first seen at sunrise in the cotton field, the one that showed the things underneath the steadiness. "You're doing the look," she said. "What look?" "I was thinking," he said carefully, "that you look like you're doing something that matters to you." She held his gaze. "I am." "Good." He went back to his numbers. The final yield was 3.5 bales per acre on 860 acres, a strong number, well above the county average for a drought year. The result of 2 years of careful water management and Lucas's knowledge of his own soil that no corporate operator running this land from a Lubbock office would ever have accumulated. Lucas filed the final payment against the restructured banknote on September 25th. The Merritt farm was, for the first time in 2 years, current on its obligations. He went to the edge of the south field that evening and stood there for a long time. The harvested field was a different landscape, the cotton plants stripped and stubbled, the soil exposed, the horizon suddenly visible from a different angle. It looked, in the early autumn evening light, like a beginning rather than an end. He heard her footsteps on the dry earth behind him. She stopped beside him, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. "It's quiet," she said. "After harvest, it always is." He looked out at the field like the land exhales. She looked at the horizon where the sky was doing its evening thing, the slow, dramatic burning that never quite became routine, regardless of how many times you saw it. She'd been here long enough now that she'd stopped thinking of it as scenery and started thinking of it as home, which was a shift she hadn't anticipated and was still in the process of understanding. "I want to talk to the Lubbock nonprofit seriously," she said. "There's a program director position opening. It's not what I used to make. It's not New York." She paused. "But it's work I actually want to do." He was quiet. "I'm not asking you about any decisions," she said. I wanted you to know that I'm thinking about it, that there's a version of what's next that keeps me in this general geography." He turned and looked at her. In the evening light, with the burnt orange of the harvest sky behind her, and the Texas wind moving through her hair, and the specific quality of directness in her eyes that had distinguished her from the very beginning, from that first morning in the diner. She laughed, a real laugh, not a social one. He'd learned the difference. He'd been storing examples of the real one. He reached out and took her hand the way she'd taken his in the cotton field at sunrise, simply, without calculation, because it was the natural next thing. "My grandfather built a house on this property," he said. "The original house. It's about a quarter-mile north of the current one. It needs work. A lot of work." He held her gaze. "But it's on the land, and the bones are good." She was quiet for a moment, understanding what he was telling her without him having to say more of it. "Show me," she said. "Tomorrow morning before sunrise, before sunrise." They stood together at the edge of the harvested field as the sky went from orange to purple to the first dark blue of evening, and the stars began their slow emergence. First one, then 3, then a dozen. Then the whole extravagant abundance of a panhandle sky on a clear September night. More stars than seemed possible, more than the dark could reasonably contain. The border collie came from somewhere and pressed against Lucas's leg. He reached down and put his hand on the dog's head. Savannah leaned her shoulder against his arm and he didn't move away, and the land around them was quiet with the particular quiet of a place that had been worked and was resting and would be worked again. The Merritt farm stood on the high plains of the Texas Panhandle as it had stood for 3 generations, not unchanged, not without its scars, not without the evidence of everything it had cost to keep it, but standing. Under a sky that remained as it had always been, indifferent to the struggles conducted beneath it, and somehow, in that indifference, exactly right. There were things still to figure out. There always were. The well in the northeast quadrant needed a new pump by spring. The market price for cotton was volatile heading into the new year. The nonprofit position was not confirmed. The conversation between Savannah and her father was ongoing, and would be for some time. The mortgage was current, but not small. None of that was resolved. Life, Lucas had understood since the age of 15, did not resolve. It continued, with more grace on some mornings than others, requiring the same thing every day regardless of the difficulty. You showed up. You did the work. And on the mornings when the light hit the field right, when the cotton was white and open and the sky was everything it could be and the person next to you was exactly where they'd chosen to be, you understood, without needing to say it, that the showing up had been worth it. It had always been worth it. The stars turned overhead, slow and immense, over 1,200 acres of Texas's earth that a man had refused to give up, and the night held them, and the land held them, and nothing more needed to be said.